We're going to take care of Venezuela. What's happening in Venezuela is a disgrace. All options are on the table, everyone. The strong ones and the less than strong ones. Every option, and you know what I mean by strong.
We've heard this story before. The people are suffering. They're starving. They're protesting. Being killed by the National Guard. They're eating out of trash cans. Journalists and political dissidents are being jailed and murdered. We have to help them. But that footage was all from recent events in Haiti, the Philippines, Brazil, and Saudi Arabia. Why does Trump condone these dictatorships but draws the line at Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela? Why will he have a summit with Kim Jong-un but refuse to have a dialogue with Maduro?
Would you personally negotiate with Nicolas Maduro to convince him to exit?
Well, he has requested a meeting, and I've turned it down because we're very far along in the process.
What process is he referring to? Are we ignoring worse protests, poverty, and killings in other humanitarian crises around the globe? Are we making the situation in Venezuela worse?
But very quickly, the fact is we don't want to do a lot of nation building. We've had bad experience there with that. On the other hand, we have a strong opposition there. We just have to empower them rather than go in and do something, right?
That's right. There will be nothing good that will come of the United States taking too front of a role in that situation, given the historical framework that exists there and the independence of the country. We tried that in 2002. But I think, again, the threat of escalating these energy sanctions potentially, powering the opposition will be the way to go.
It cannot be understated that sanctions imposed by the United States have amplified these problems and prevented any economic recovery. Sanctions are how North America and its allies stand up to oppressive regimes around the world. But more often than not, they hurt the country's economy and civilian population rather than change the behavior of the government. Every additional sanction imposed against Venezuela has been done by an executive order from the president without permission of Congress. Furthermore, he has had to declare a state of emergency for each. But how Maduro's government poses a threat to national security has never been explained. Juan Guaido is the president of Venezuela, according to the United States and several European countries, even though he was not elected. On one hand, the new government will be given a huge line of credit and won't be sanctioned. That alone makes him an attractive alternative. On the other hand, the usual suspects are at the heart of this regime change. Mike Pompeo, John Bolton, Marco Rubio, Elliott Abrams, and other American operatives are coordinating with the opposition to overthrow Maduro. These are the architects and profiteers of the Iraq War, the Iran-Contra affair, and other immense failures of American foreign policy. In every regime change war these men were involved in, cells of popular resistance to the new government persisted for decades, only to retake the country eventually. Juan Guaido's coalition touts freedom and democracy, but they also intend to imprison people who worked for the current government and the Socialist Party. Is the imprisonment of political opponents and the support of unelected political leaders the type of freedom and democracy that the U.S. seeks to ship abroad?
2 weeks ago, the United States officially recognized the legitimate government of Venezuela and its new president, Juan Guaido. We stand with the Venezuelan people in their noble quest for freedom, and we condemn the brutality of the Maduro regime, whose socialist policies have turned that nation from being the wealthiest in South America into a state of abject poverty and despair.
Trump says Maduro's regime is brutal and his people live in abject poverty. But how is the media and the government informing everyday Americans about this humanitarian crisis? Even when all the information isn't available and the full story is not yet known, events, images, and footage are strung together without the care that the seriousness of such a crisis should involve. So if there is a crisis there, our media is failing to disseminate that information and unwittingly providing ammunition for Maduro's regime. For example, on February 6th, 2019, Mike Pompeo tweeted that Maduro had erected a tanker and shipping containers in order to prevent humanitarian aid from entering the country. Virtually all mainstream news outlets reported on this story without doing any research.
World News tonight, the military is attempting to block humanitarian aid from entering Venezuela by barricading a bridge at the key border crossing.
President Nicolas Maduro continued to block a key bridge and prevent the aid from being delivered. Look.
A major highway, key bridge, a border crossing. The Tiendas Bridge is none of these things. The fencing erected by the Colombian government had been blocking the bridge, which had never been open to traffic since its completion in 2016, and aid trucks were planned to cross at the Simón Bolivar Bridge 6 kilometers away. But this is just scratching the surface. The point is, the media saw something in Venezuela that they did not understand, and instead of uncovering the truth, they asked, how can we use this to make Maduro look like a tyrant? You might say, even if this is a mistake by the media, he's preventing humanitarian aid from reaching desperate people. Surely that's an act of a tyrant. In a brief moment of clarity on CNN, Cyril Veneer summed up the very problem with that idea.
Wow. I mean, the stakes are huge, and there's sovereignty involved as well, because Colombia just can't drive into Venezuela and do what it wants in another country.
While Donald Trump's administration advocates open borders, are Venezuelans actually suffering so much that their sovereignty should be violated?
These locals have little, yet they know of others much worse off. Of children who face starvation if no one helps. So they do, volunteering to cook donated food.
But what does existing data say about the needs of Venezuelan people? According to the Global Hunger Index, they have an 11.4 rating, placing them among 24 countries suffering from moderate hunger and malnourishment. Compare that to US-backed governments like the Philippines, which sports a severe 20.2 rating, and Haiti with an alarming 35.4 rating. These are countries that cooperate with the US government, and they're in a much more desperate situation. The Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN recognized Venezuela for reducing the hunger and undernourishment in the country by half from 1990 to 2015. A large reason behind the people's support for Hugo Chávez's movement was his promise to reject the IMF's structural adjustment policies and implement policies that provided food to the sectors of the population with the lowest incomes. How did we reward these Venezuelans who solved a humanitarian crisis and reached their Millennium Development Goal, cutting hunger and undernourishment by half? We decided with our European allies that we are no longer going to sell them food. In 2015, the Obama administration implemented sanctions, restricting the government's ability to use its own revenue. So whose fault is the rise in hunger? Is it the Venezuelan government or the United States? But in the beginning of this year, out of the goodness of our hearts, we offered $20 million of humanitarian aid with no clear plan for how it was going to be distributed.
As we sit here, there is US aid across the border in Colombia, waiting to be brought across. We have met many people here who tell us they are desperately in need of aid. Why not allow it through?
Primero que es un show que ha montado el gobierno de Estados Unidos con la complacencia del gobierno colombiano para tratar de humillar a los venezolanos. Venezuela es un país que tiene su capacidad para satisfacer las necesidades de nuestro pueblo. Venezuela es un país que tiene los problemas que puede tener cualquier otro país.
Are you honestly saying there is no hunger in Venezuela?
Yo les digo que ustedes han montado un estereotipo en la BBC de Londres, en los medios estadounidenses también, de una Venezuela que no existe. En todo caso, te digo, los Estados Unidos, el gobierno de Donald Trump, nos ha secuestrado 10.000 millones de dólares de cuentas bancarias que son nuestras. Nos tienen secuestrado miles de millones de dólares en oro en Londres, que son nuestros, que es dinero para comprar insumos, materias primas, alimentos, medicina. Muy sencillo. Si se quiere ayudar a Venezuela, liberen los recursos que por miles de millones nos pertenecen y no vengan con un show barato, un show de indignidad, de humillación, donde ofrecen 20 millones de dólares en una comida contaminada y podrida.
¡Se está salvando la bandera de la ayuda humanitaria!
¡Vamos a cesar! ¡Vamos a cesar! ¡Vamos a cesar!
Maduro's loyalists turned on their own people. As the world watched, they set fire to trucks loaded with food and medicine desperately needed by the Venezuelan people.
A few weeks later, on February 23rd, images of aid trucks burning at the Colombian border flashed across the TV screens of America.
Venezuelan National Guardsmen, under orders from President Nicolas Maduro, attacked 2 aid trucks yesterday, lighting them on fire.
It was reported that Maduro's military had intentionally set the fires. It was later proven with video that the humanitarian trucks were set on fire by anti-Maduro protesters who threw a Molotov cocktail that hit one of the trucks.
There's a sick tyrant, Maduro, who's denying food to starving Venezuelans and medicine to sick Venezuelans, burning trucks with... This is the worst of a tyrant.
Along with food and medicine, nails and wires were found in the trucks, tools for helping the opposition construct barricades. It's no wonder the U.S. didn't want Maduro inspecting this Trojan horse.
Do these media outlets have no interest in discovering the truth? Whether their motivation is to garner ratings, appease advertisers, or act as a mouthpiece for Trump's foreign policy, real journalism doesn't seem to be part of the agenda. Weeks later, a few news outlets had redacted their stories in the face of overwhelming evidence. But by then, the news was much more preoccupied with weaving another tale about nationwide power outages, which, once again, they knew nothing about. Venezuela's state media, Telesur, reported that anti-government saboteurs were responsible for an attack on the Guri Dam. In an email from the Center for Applied Nonviolent Action and Strategies to the Goldman Sachs executive and the private intelligence firm Stratfor from 2010, it's explained how unintentional sabotage of the Venezuelan electric grid could be used to foment a coup. Quote, "This would likely have the impact of galvanizing public unrest in a way that no opposition group could ever hope to generate. At that point in time, an opposition group would be best served to take advantage of the situation and spin it against Chavez and toward their needs." The plan had been in the works for years to blame any power outage in Venezuela on the Socialist Party, and the media jumps to the conclusion that it was Maduro's incompetence and kleptocracy that caused the blackout.
Nuestra labor desde el Parlamento es crear las certezas para que cese definitivamente la usurpación. No habrá solución al problema eléctrico mientras usurpen funciones en Miraflores. No habrá agua a las casas, mucho menos gas doméstico. Pueblo de Venezuela, vamos a acelerar la presión interna necesaria para seguir sumando en este proceso del cese definitivo de la usurpación. Es el momento de dar el paso definitivo hacia la transición en Venezuela. Es el momento de dar el paso definitivo hacia lograr los objetivos y lo repito, el cese de la oscuridad vendrá definitivamente con el cese de la usurpación.
Juan Guaido and his coalition in parliament threatened that they would not allow Maduro's government to restore electricity or running water until they got what they wanted politically. And yet power was restored in less than a week. Why should we support the overthrow of a government that is faster at restoring electricity than we are. After all, Puerto Rico was without power for 11 months. Does that mean everyone should recognize Trump as illegitimate?
The problem in Venezuela is not that socialism has been poorly implemented, but that socialism has been faithfully implemented.
This image shows people drinking from an underground freshwater spring that flows into the Guare River. But for some reason, it was reported as being a sewage drain, and that Venezuelans were so desperate that they were drinking raw sewage. It's easy enough to take a picture of someone next to dirty water, but what does that say about Venezuela? Worldwide, 780 million people do not have access to an improved water source. 3 to 4 million people die every year from waterborne illness. 800,000 of those are children. And how many of those millions are Venezuelan? In short, none. In Venezuela, in 1999, 85% of the country had access to improved drinking water. The socialist government of Hugo Chavez brought that up to 96%. How are we rewarding this humanitarian feat? We're blocking them from importing raw materials for improving their infrastructure and water system, preventing them from saving any more lives than they already have.
A long line of people filling buckets or jugs with spring water. And I think it's important to make the distinction. This water is clean, right?
Yeah, people from Caracas always took water from this spring. But this group of people that's taking the water now is because of the problem or the consequences of the blackout.
I've been here for a few weeks now. It seems like the issue is that everything's happened at once. A massive power outage affecting everything.
It's very curious that our communication minister, our information minister, Jorge Rodriguez, announced that there was like 3 or 5 types of sabotage against Venezuela, electromagnetical. And maybe that was what Mr. Donald Trump was talking about when he said that he has all the options over the table, you know?
Ha llegado la hora de la recuperación económica y
The media has unwittingly shown one aspect of Venezuela that's accurate. The protests are not peaceful. Far from representing the poor and needy, they test their weapons on lavish private ranches. They are not pro-democracy. They kill cops with improvised explosive devices. Carry out race-based lynchings. And burn aid trucks. If Black Lives Matter or anti-fascist groups did half the damage these kids did, Americans would be rallying around a government of law and order. While deaths at these violent anti-government protests number in the hundreds, that's a direct result of the violence of the protesters. Imagine if military trucks were being set on fire with Molotov cocktails in the United States. While I don't support violent government crackdowns, I do understand why Maduro is in a tough position. Will the alternative president, recognized by 50 nations, be better? Guaido wants to transition the country into one where Chavez supporters are hunted down with impunity, where food subsidies for the poor are a thing of the past, and the basic needs of the people are held hostage if he doesn't get his way.
There were very many large-scale protests in the street. We have seen some of those ourselves. We have also seen your supporters in the streets. But do you dispute that the opposition has been able to bring large numbers out? And these people have said they are calling for change.
Sí, los vi y tuvieron plenas garantías, salieron a grandes demostraciones, tanto de la oposición como nosotros. Venezuela tiene una democracia movilizada, una democracia con pueblo. Pueblo que nos apoya a la revolución y pueblo también que se opone a la revolución. Cuando ellos quieran salir a marchar, siempre tienen todas las garantías. Y siempre yo digo, ojalá lo hagan en paz, porque tienen pequeños grupos de sectores violentos que cuando terminan las demostraciones, las marchas de la oposición, siempre buscan un enfrentamiento con la policía para tratar de perturbar. La oposición tiene toda la libertad de marchar cuantas veces quiera para exigir sus consignas, sus propuestas, y nosotros también mantendremos a nuestro pueblo movilizado. Esto es una democracia afortunadamente movilizada con pueblo.
Dicen que nos estamos muriendo de hambre, no, nosotros no nos estamos peleando. Que nosotros estamos peleando entre nosotros, no, que digan la verdad de lo que está pasando, ¿verdad? Porque nosotros aquí le elegimos un presidente, no a Guaidó que está por allá, no, aquí elegimos a un presidente con voto, ¿ves? Y lo proclamó el pueblo.
Accusations of ballot stuffing, vote machine tampering, and vote manipulation are baseless. International election monitors found no evidence of fraud. The opposition actively campaigned to prevent the election from being monitored at all, but Maduro's government called for a transparent process.
The entire electoral process is free and fair. Obviously, you have not just those Latin American countries, but also the United States coming out strongly and saying that these elections were neither free nor fair. But also, Richard, they were entirely underwhelming this time, and that's all you have to look at. The turnout was less than 50%, if it was even that high.
Voter turnout that's as low as 50% is a justification for these countries to not recognize an election. The election was boycotted by the opposition, either because they knew they didn't have the popular support, or because they weren't concerned with winning the election. They were concerned with delegitimizing the Socialist Party of Venezuela and convincing the world to help ban them from politics forever. On April 30th, Juan Guaidó stood on a bridge with a megaphone and a handful of soldiers and declared that the military was on his side and a coup against Maduro was underway. 10 miles away, much larger crowds turned out to defend the presidential palace and denounce the coup.
Today we know that all Venezuelans, all of them, are in favor of change. And today, what the soldiers are doing, not just in Caracas, but throughout the whole of Venezuela, is getting to the side of the Constitution. It's a coup against Maduro. Those who can send a text message, please call everybody and ask everybody to come and join us. The military are here, but we need more people to join us. We're going to stand here. Everybody should come here and join us in Altamira in this moment as Operation Liberty, Operation Freedom has begun.
While Guaidó announced that a coup was underway, Chavistas gathered in Miraflores in support of the government.
Pero todos los días, compañeras, compañeros, todos los días pienso cómo mejorar. ¿Qué cosas hay que cambiar que estamos haciendo mal y tenemos que cambiar definitivamente? Quiero asumir un plan para cambiar todo, para mejorar todo, para rectificar los errores. En medio de la batalla.
Traidores, autonombrados, dicen que ellos los engañaron, pero este pueblo sabe que no están engañados. Son traidores de nuestra patria, traidores de nuestro pueblo y tienen que ser juzgados bajo las leyes de nuestro país como traidores a la patria.
I've heard it said that any Venezuelan who supports the government should not be trusted because they're being paid.
You can say that about anyone, but sometimes there is a paper trail. The U.S. has spent $49 million funding the opposition in Venezuela since 2009. So while Chavistas could be getting paid or not, we don't know. Guaidó and his protesters definitely are.
Anya Parampil is a reporter who just spent a month in Venezuela reporting from the ground there, and she joins us here in studio. Anya, thanks very much for coming on.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
So what do you make of the news coverage of this?
Your viewers won't be shocked to hear this, Tucker, but the news media, the fake news media, are lying about the situation in Venezuela. Let me put it for you this way. Imagine if Hillary Clinton had refused to admit defeat after losing to President Trump in 2016 and banded together a group of 24 U.S. soldiers and attempted to take the White House by force. I don't think she'd be walking freely on the streets the way Juan Guaido is walking right now in Caracas, and I certainly think the news media would be calling it rightfully a coup.
Meanwhile, the U.S. expelled Venezuelan diplomats and seized the embassy in Washington. But this process took well over a month because protesters occupied the building.
I was in Venezuela last May for the re-election of President Maduro. There was actually an election. He was not a dictator. 9 million people voted. Maduro received 6 million votes. There were more than 150 international election observers, and they unanimously came out and said that it met international standards for democracy, there was no fraud, and Maduro was legitimately elected. And comparing that to Guaido, Guaido won second place in the National Assembly election, 24% of the vote in the second smallest state with a tiny political party. So he barely got into the legislature from a tiny state with a tiny party, and then he was elevated by Trump and Pence to be the president. As soon as Guaido announced, Trump immediately endorsed him, got the right-wing governments in Latin America and the Western European countries to join him. Why? Because the example of an independent Venezuela is a powerful example that they don't want to see.
Finally, after water and power was cut to the building, police arrested the 4 remaining protesters and charged them with interfering with the protective functions of the State Department.
Because we hear there is a lot of intimidation in the army now and that people are being jailed if they speak out against you.
Bueno, ese es otro de los mitos que se creó en toda esta campaña. Así que esa Fuerza Armada está leal a la Constitución, leal, firmemente leal a la Constitución, movilizada en defensa, preparándose para la defensa del país. Donald Trump le ha dado por Twitter órdenes increíbles, Orla. Donald Trump, John Bolton, Mike Pompeo, Mike Pence han escrito órdenes a la Fuerza Armada venezolana para que se alcen armas contra el presidente de la República. Han llegado a un extremo que estoy seguro nunca se había hecho con ningún país del mundo. ¿Y dónde está la Fuerza Armada? ¿Se va a poner al servicio de Donald Trump? No. La Fuerza Armada está leal al país, a la patria, a la Constitución y reconociendo a su comandante en jefe, legítimo.
Is there any set of circumstances in which you would consider leaving power?
No se trata de una persona, Orla, que está en el poder porque yo quiero, o de que abandone el poder como una decisión individual. Yo formo parte de un movimiento social, político, histórico, revolucionario. Y ese gran movimiento popular me colocó en esta responsabilidad, cumpliendo todos los pasos constitucionales, requisitos electorales. Y el mandato que me dieron es muy poderoso. Y yo tengo que cumplir ese mandato. Con mi vida mismo he jurado. Yo juré ante el Tribunal Supremo de Justicia dar mi vida por cumplir y hacer cumplir esta Constitución. Ese es el mandato. Y yo lo voy a cumplir más allá de lo que se pueda decir y lo que se pueda hacer.
What if Nicolas Maduro is right, and he won't step down because he swore on his life to defend the Constitution? And what if the armed forces are loyal and they defend the same Constitution that Maduro does? What if giving the Venezuelan military orders over Twitter is never going to work? Judging by the strength of the opposition and the low approval of Maduro, there was a good possibility that an opposition candidate could have won. All Venezuelan citizens are allowed to vote, even those who have fled the country and lobby the United States government to sanction or overthrow Maduro. But they didn't want to win the presidency. They wanted to delegitimize Maduro completely. They wanted to ban the PSUV from participating in politics. So they chose not to vote. Is non-participation in democracy an effective way to win? Do we want to say to the world that it is? I'll let John Bolton explain.
We want everybody to know we're looking at all this very seriously. We don't want any American businesses or investors caught by surprise. They can see what President Trump did yesterday. We're following through on it.
So if you think of a company like Citgo, which is owned by PDVSA, which is the state-run oil company there in Venezuela, we have a lot of those Citgo assets right here in the U.S. Is that something, for example, sir, that you're looking at?
Yeah, look, we're in conversation with major American companies now that are either in Venezuela or, in the case of Citgo, here in the United States. I think we're trying to get to the same end result here. You know, Venezuela is one of the three countries I call the troika of tyranny. It'll make a big difference to the United States economically if we could have American oil companies really invest in and produce the oil capabilities in Venezuela.
Manufacturing jobs have been leaving the country for decades because companies are growing their industries overseas to profit off of cheap labor. All the while, American wages are stagnated and the towns that were built around those companies are crumbling. A few remaining strongholds, like Venezuela, refuse to hand over their land and resources, but a group of Latin American countries and Venezuelan emigres are lobbying to force their hand. It isn't Mexicans, El Salvadorians, Guatemalans, or Hondurans who are stealing our jobs. Our jobs have already been shipped to those countries, and people flee because of economic and political instability that U.S. meddling has created. Now it's Venezuelans. That is the price of ousting Maduro by this method of regime change instead of a democratic one. But if it doesn't work, is a military option on the table? Will our sons and daughters have to die for this? Will this be Trump's Vietnam? Since the failed coup of April 30th and the seizure of Venezuela's embassy, the U.S. announced further sanctions amounting to a full embargo.
This now covers everything having to do with the government of Venezuela, every aspect of it, and perhaps even more importantly, extends the authority to impose sanctions on all those who cooperate or assist or support any element of the government of Venezuela. So that includes any foreign entity, government, corporation, person who contributes to keeping the Maduro regime in power.
How many people will starve because of this? I know many Americans will simply place all the blame on socialism. The Trump regime insists the embargo will allow exceptions for humanitarian assistance, such as food and medicine, but as we've seen, our trucks are only going to get lit on fire at the border by the very protesters we hand it to. The only entity with the infrastructure to distribute humanitarian aid is the government, and Guaido is not a part of that government. When Venezuela cannot purchase its own food or medicine, the only aid that people will be receiving is the aid from countries that defy U.S. sanctions: China, Cuba, Russia. We shouldn't tell Venezuelans that they have to change their politics or starve. All American workers should denounce this effort to expand American companies abroad and send our jobs overseas at the expense of the people of Venezuela and the people of the United States. Thank you for listening. Like and subscribe if you want to hear more political content from me.
In 2016, your government created a program known as CLAP to help offset some of the social costs of sanctions. And now the United States says that it wants to sanction the CLAP program while it is denying Venezuela assets to buy food for import. An advisor to the opposition candidate, Henry Falcón, has written an article and told our colleague, Aaron Mate, that he believes that as a result of these sanctions, Venezuela will experience a famine in the next 12 months. And he said that the sanctions are designed to do just that, to cause a famine. Is this something you're concerned about? What can you do in concrete terms to prevent this from happening?
Look, this didn't happen in Saddam Hussein's Iraq. If you remember, Saddam Hussein's Iraq had UN-approved sanctions. They were not unilateral measures. They were not illegal. They were multilateral and legal, although they may have been unjust. The UN Security Council approved an oil for food program, oil for medicine. Even Saddam Hussein, at this time when he was in a military war with the US, the UN Security Council opened a path for him to import food and medicine. They prevent us from getting access to food, medicine, essential goods. We're not asking that anyone give this to us. We have the money to buy it. What's true is that Venezuelan families who receive support through free public health care, free public schools, support in housing, support through a program called the Homeland Card that gives a direct subsidy, money. In addition to all that support, families receive groceries. Now we have a special plan for animal protein so families can receive all their food. That program has just been sanctioned by the Trump administration at the request of the coup-supporting Venezuelan opposition. The U.S. public should know this. The world should know this. It's something unthinkable, the world. They're going after our food. They say we have to leave the Venezuelan people without food. They say it openly and publicly. They're immoral. We have to defeat them. U.S. public opinion has to rise up in solidarity with the Venezuelan people. But I can guarantee, Max, that the CLAP program will continue, that there will be no famine in Venezuela.